Until the Middle Ages, the Arabian Peninsula was a backwater of little interest to the more advanced cultures of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, India, Greece, and Rome. It was by and large considered a wasteland of desert dunes, only fit for people who were seen as nothing more than Bedouin barbarians. The geography and geopolitics of Arab empires, primarily the Rashiduns, Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphates, played a critical role in shaping not only the Middle East, but also North Africa, Central Asia, and parts of Europe, before eventually passing on the mantle to many of the peoples they conquered. The insignificance of the Arabian Peninsula changed during the 7th century, when Muhammad spoke of a new religion, Islam. Most people at the time in this region were polytheistic, worshipping a number of gods and goddesses related to the moon and other celestial bodies. The region was in close proximity to Mesopotamia and the Levant, which at this point were ruled by the Eastern Roman Empire, made up of primarily Greeks who practiced Orthodox Christianity. There were also several Jewish populations in the region. To the northeast, there was the Persian Empire, who practiced the dualistic religion known as Zoroastrianism. Now, while not a major commercial hub, or series of hubs, the Arab cities of Mecca and Medina were en route to more complex city-states in southern Arabia, which is now Yemen, where at the time there was a pretty considerable difference in terms of the culture that existed here as opposed to what is now Western Saudi Arabia. This region also had close ties to Ethiopia across the Red Sea, one of the few places in sub-Saharan Africa where you saw complex societies. Muhammad was a caravan trader and raider who worked along these trade routes, and according to the story, was spoken to by Gabriel the Archangel, telling him that he was the final prophet in a succession of prophets, largely inspired by Judaism and Christianity. These prophets were Adam, Noah, Abraham, Ishmael rather than Isaac, Jesus or Isa, and others, finally ending with Muhammad. The geographic proximity to lands that practiced Judaism and Christianity, and to a lesser extent Zoroastrianism, laid the foundation of Islam, which synergized these beliefs with those of pre-Islamic Arabian polytheism. Concepts like the Kaaba and Jinn have Arabian polytheistic origins. Muhammad and his followers would take over Medina and later Mecca, making them the second and first holiest cities in Islam respectively. These warriors were used to the harsh desert environment, limited arable land and water resources, which led to a tribal, ironclad nomadic culture that made them tough as nails, far tougher than many other enemies. On top of that, the two major powers to the north, the Eastern Roman Greek Christians to the west, and the Persian Zoroastrians to the east, had been clobbering each other for centuries over control of Mesopotamia and the Levant. This led to both of them being far weaker. With the effective combination of camel and horse cavalry, both of which were quite common in this part of the world, the Arabs, with their new faith of Islam, managed to bring both Greek and Persian empires to their knees, conquering Mesopotamia and the Levant. The first generation of Muslims were led by Muhammad, followed by the Rashiduns, his closest friends, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Despite the confidence of the new faith, fractures would emerge soon after Muhammad's death. Some believed that the followers must be related to Muhammad and chose Ali, his cousin and son-in-law. These would eventually merge into the sect of Shiites. Others preferred a non-hereditary system, which would become the current dominant form of Islam, the Sunnis. This conflict exists to this day, but that is a story for another time. Mesopotamia, to the north of Arabia, is the land between two rivers, and had at the time a much larger population, a much older history, and was far better for farming. The Levant had access to the Mediterranean Sea. It was also home to Jerusalem, the holiest city in Judaism, which is considered the third holiest city in Islam, given how much Islam has borrowed from Judaism. Further north and inland, you get the city of Damascus, the current capital of Syria, which is arguably the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It was on the road to Damascus where St. Paul of Christianity would become Christian. Muslims would turn Damascus into their fourth holiest city. And after the Rashidun Ali was assassinated, the Rashiduns would be taken over by the Umayyad Caliphate, who would make Damascus their capital. However, the Levant would contain some of the most vigilant Christian minority populations, who would pay the jizya tax, something that some people brand as tolerant, but in reality was mostly an extortion racket in which these minorities paid money for the luxury of not being killed. To this day, Lebanon and to a lesser extent Syria have substantial Christian populations. These people by and large speak Arabic, which makes them Arabs but not Muslims. Eventually, the Arabs with Islam would expand into North Africa, with Egypt all the way to Morocco being taken over, securing the southern Mediterranean. Egypt was one of the major agriculture and economic powerhouses. At that point, Egypt had been heavily Hellenized and Christianized, but eventually would have a new power, Islam, which remains the dominant culture to this day, as ancient Egyptian culture is by and large long gone. The Maghreb of what is now Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria were quickly taken over from European and Berber people, rapidly Arabizing and Islamicizing them. In Persia and Central Asia, the Arabs were able to force the population of Zoroastrians to convert to Islam. While they were successful in Islamizing Iran, they failed at Arabizing Iran. To this day, most Iranians speak Farsi and other Indo-European languages rather than the Semitic language of Arabic. To this day, there is still some cultural resentment by Persian nationalists against Arab and Islamic influence. The conquest of Persia did provide access to the Silk routes, and eventually the invasion and conquest of parts of the Indian subcontinent. This would be the foundation of the modern Islamic country of Pakistan, in sharp contrast to the predominantly Hindu India. On the other side of the known world, they invaded the Iberian Peninsula, which is located in modern-day Spain and Portugal. However, they stretched themselves too thin and were replaced by the Abbasid Caliphate, ranging from 1750 AD or CE, depending on what you prefer, to 1258 CE or AD. The capital moved to Baghdad, the modern capital of Iraq. This would be the golden age of Islam. Major achievements in science, philosophy, medicine, and trade emerged. However, the military expansion came to a relative halt. They focused more on what they already had, rather than conquering others. They by and large controlled key trade routes, given the Silk Road all the way moving through the Indian Ocean. However, they were still stretched too thin. Fragmentation began in the 9th century, and the rise of a semi-independent set of states, such as the Fatimids in Egypt and the Umayyads in Spain. A group called the Mumtazilites promoted reason and evidence, which allowed the Arabs to excel in science, technology, and art. However, due to political machinations, they were eventually replaced with imams who claimed that the Quran is above reason and evidence. This led to a decline in scientific inquiry and technology. There were also a number of rebellions, most notably the Zanj Rebellion, one of the most bloody slave revolts in human history. The descendants of this rebellion make up Iraq's black population. The final blow was the Mongol invasion that led to the fall of the Baghdad Empire, or the Abbasid Empire, in 1258. They burned the Baghdad House of Wisdom and ended the Golden Age. This would be the last of the major Arab empires. However, many of the people they conquered, namely the Persians and Turks, would take up the mantle of Islam, eventually being taken over by the very people groups that they had conquered. The last major Islamic empire in the Middle East were the Ottoman Turks. However, by the 1800s, they are already the sick man of Europe, and by the end of World War II, during the early 20th century, they had collapsed. In part due to an Arab revolt, as Arabs were sick and tired of their Turkish overlords. The Europeans granted Arabs independence. No, just kidding, they colonized them. The British, French, and Italians split up the Middle East into borders with very little regard when it came to religion, ethnicity, language, etc. Or even, for that matter, natural geography. After World War II, the Europeans could no longer cling to their empires, and various Arab states were given independence, but they still had these terrible borders. And on top of that, they were by and large technologically and socially behind their European counterparts. Nonetheless, today, Arabic is still one of the most spoken languages by Arab Muslims and Christians. However, there is no Arab superstate. and much of the Arab world is deeply divided. With the arguable exceptions of Tunisia and Lebanon, none are remotely democratic. Monarchies such as Jordan tend to actually be more stable than republics like Syria and Iraq. Furthermore, the origin of the Arabs, Saudi Arabia, and the other Gulf states have become rich through hydrocarbon resources, and while they are still autocratic, they are still some of the most wealthy, stable, and internationally interconnected nations in the world, with social values that are rapidly modernizing. Thanks for watching.